All right, let's talk about a building that was, so much more than just concrete and steel. We're diving into the story of the original Wembley Stadium. This wasn't just some venue. For almost 80 years, it was like a main character in Britain's story. It wasn't the backdrop, it was the stage where history happened.
Hey, don't just take my word for it. The legend himself, Pelé, called it the Cathedral of Football. And that one phrase, it tells you everything you need to know about how people felt about this place, its global status. This was where dreams were made and, yeah, sometimes broken.
So we're going to journey through the 5 acts of Wembley's life. Its totally accidental birth, its reign as the Cathedral of Football, how it became more than just a pitch, its moment on the world stage, and finally, its emotional farewell. Let's get right into it. Okay, so our story kicks off with a pretty big surprise. The most famous stadium in the world, it was never, ever meant to be permanent. Seriously, its survival was a total accident. Yeah, its fate was basically sealed before it even opened. It was thrown up in just 300 days as the Empire Stadium, and it was built to be the amazing centerpiece for the 1924 British Empire exhibition. But the plan was always simple. Once the exhibition was over, tear it down. And that's pretty much what happened. The exhibition itself didn't make much money, and this grand stadium was officially declared financially unviable. A classic white elephant. So it went into liquidation, with the demolition crews practically waiting at the gates. But then, an unlikely hero steps into the picture, a guy named Arthur Elvin. And get this, he was the one hired to demolish the place. But he saw potential where everyone else just saw a financial disaster. He somehow scrapes together the cash, £127,000, and buys the whole thing himself, literally saving it from the wrecking ball. His masterstroke? Bringing in Greyhound racing. And just like that, the stadium finally had a steady, profitable income. It was saved. So, now that its future was secure, Wembley could finally start its real destiny, becoming the undisputed home of English football. And wow, what a start it was! The stadium's very first event was the 1923 FA Cup final. The organizers just completely, and I mean completely, underestimated how excited people were to see it. The whole day just descended into this legendary chaos. So, the official capacity was about 127,000. But the estimates, they say there were over 240,000 people there. Nearly double, with absolutely no room left in the stands. Thousands and thousands of fans just spilled out onto the pitch. It seriously looked like the match was going to be called off before a ball was even kicked. And this is where one of Wembley's most famous images comes from. A single policeman, PC George Scory, on his white horse Billy, just calmly starts nudging the crowd back to the sidelines, making enough space for the game to actually happen. And because of him, that match is forever known as the White Horse Final. The White Horse Final was just the beginning. 30 years later, you get the Matthews Final. This time, it wasn't chaos, it was just pure drama. A 38-year-old Stanley Matthews basically willed his Blackpool team to come back from being 3-1 down to win 4-3. It was unbelievable. And that game also had the only hat-trick ever scored in an FA Cup final at the old Wembley. But of course, Wembley's absolute crowning moment in football has to be 1966. England played every single one of their World Cup games on that sacred turf. From the tense group games right through to the final, that stadium became a fortress. And it all led to that historic 4-2 win over West Germany. It was the nation's greatest sporting moment, and Wembley was center stage. But here's the thing. As important as football was to Wembley's soul, its story is so much bigger than that. This place was a real chameleon. The sheer variety of stuff held here is just mind-blowing. It hosted the 1948 Olympics. It was home to the Rugby League Challenge Cup final. You had Speedway championships, you had NFL games, you had massive heavyweight boxing matches, and then you had the pure spectacle stuff, like Evel Knievel trying to jump 13 buses, and the huge WWF SummerSlam event in '92. And these were not small events. The crowds were absolutely massive. Sure, football holds the official record, but Rugby League could pull in almost 100,000 people. Even Speedway was getting over 90,000 fans in there. This place was an absolute titan of live events. So beyond all the sports, Wembley found this whole other life. It became one of the most important, most iconic music venues on the entire planet. Just think about this number for a second, 1.9 billion. That's how many people all around the globe were estimated to be watching the Live Aid concert in 1985. On that day, Wembley wasn't just a stadium in London anymore. No way. It was the absolute heart of a global moment, beaming this incredible message of hope to pretty much every corner of the planet. And the list of music legends who played on that stage, it's just breathtaking. Live Aid, of course, is remembered for Queen's unbelievable 20-minute set. People still say it's the greatest live performance of all time. But you also had Michael Jackson with a record 15 sold-out shows, the incredibly emotional Freddie Mercury tribute concert, and rock giants like Genesis and Bon Jovi, who pretty fittingly were the last band to ever play there.
But, like all great stories, this one had to come to an end. By the end of the 20th century, the grand old stadium was, well, it was showing its age, and the time had come to say goodbye.
The end came in the year 2000. The last FA Cup final was in May, and the very last match, an England game against Germany, was in October. Kind of sad, actually. England lost. Demolition started 2 years later, and by 2003, the iconic stadium was gone.
And of all the things that were lost when it was torn down, nothing was more missed than the famous Twin Towers. They were the symbol of the stadium, That unmistakable outline that told you that you'd made it, you were at the heart of football.
But before we wrap up, we have to talk about one last piece of Wembley legend. It's this persistent urban myth that people were obsessed with for decades. So the story went that during construction, a whole steam train had been accidentally buried right under the pitch. It's a great story, right? Well, when they dug up the ground for the new stadium, what did they find? Nope, not a train. All they found were the old foundations of something called Watkins Tower, a failed project that was on the site before Wembley was even a thought. So, from an accidental survivor to a national cathedral, the old Wembley Stadium was there for it all. Despair, triumph, pure joy, for 77 years. I think its story proves that a place can be way more than just a venue. It can become part of a nation's memory. Which kind of leaves us with one last question. Can any new building ever really capture that same magic?